experiences. Now, if some of your experiences is in one place.
That's it. So, Katambi, you are CEO of a company called Credit Advisory, and you're also an expert on climate financing and very many other things. Just take us through, first of all, what is Credit Advisory? Credit Advisory.
So it's basically what it says, advisory, but with a very specific focus on Africa, focused advocacy and Africa issues across climate change and policy making, sustainable finance, and mobilizing private and private sector capital into just transitions, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and so on. But with a very specific focus on Africa.
On Africa?
Yeah.
Why? Why Africa? And how long have you done this?
Well, I've done this for, my work in climate policy and finance for a very long time, over 10 years. And I think the focus on Africa is just quite simply because the continent needs very dedicated, honest brokers, right? You need people who are invested in the success of the continent. And sometimes that looks, it looks, depending on what the topic of the day is, it can look like anything. It's probably not the solutions that we've come to expect from mainstream sort of capacity or support that is provided, generally speaking, across consulting services. So yeah, I think.
So it's all those things. But then when you talk about climate in this country and cities here, amemalizana na delegation. Wamewapatia kila mtu yake wameenda.
Kila mtu amechukua na ameenda. Lakini kuna nyingine bado wanakuja.
Kuna wengine wanakuja.
Wakija tutaona.
Okay. Yes. So, welcome back, City.
Thank you.
So Katambi is right here just taking us through climate and understanding climate financing from an African perspective, and that's what you say. You focus on Africa because you want to be the champion in the room when Africa is having this conversation on Africa, when there's thinking for Africa and African issues. And it's a big thing because we keep talking about climate financing, but then we see people who are from outside Africa talking about climate finance. We keep talking about what climate change and the impact of climate change and then climate adaptation and all those things, but we seem to have disjointed voices. Have you experienced that in your 10 years working in this market and on climate?
Yes, of course. Primarily because I think every stakeholder at the table in climate conversations is there to represent their interests, right? So African stakeholders, they want to speak for what's in their best interests. The global North stakeholders want to speak in their best interests. Quite often, these are not sometimes compatible goals, right? And so you do need people who are sitting there and being very stubborn about being, very strong advocates for what their stakeholders need. Yes, to answer your question, yes, there's a huge disconnect, and I think this is part of what we're seeing in terms of the climate conversations. We've been talking about financing climate for the last God knows how long. It's not happening, and it's because of this kind of disconnects. And
are we seeing a shift though? And I think that's one of the things that came out from the very beginning of even a suggestion to have an ACS and to have one on the continent, and for President Ruto to say, look, we're going to have this conversation. We heard certain things being said, but are we seeing that this is shifting a little bit? That for the longest time we've seen talking. It's been talk shops. We're at COP28 this year, for crying out loud. But for somebody from the continent to then open their mouth and make it audible to the world that, look, you know what? You've been shafting us for the last however many years, and we're not going to take that anymore. How about we have a conversation where all the big boys and girls are at the table and everybody gets a chance to say something? Are we seeing a shift in the conversation, or did we just have another talk shop?
It's just concluded yesterday, so it's hard to say. I'm a bit of a cynic because I've been, as I said, over 10 years of doing this. So declarations come and go. I think the deciding factor really has to do with commitment and implementation. That's what we don't see when we talk about from the COP15 Paris agreement. There's a lot of talking. This was also a lot of talking as of now. But what is important also is that I think this was a fantastic opportunity to bring the climate conversation back home to Africa. And the reason I say that is because you hear the statistic quite often, that Africa is the most impacted by climate change, blah, 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 blah. But if you ask most Africans, a lot of them do not have nuance into what are we talking about when we talk about climate change. And so I think bringing the ACS to Kenya, to Africa, has been so remarkable in terms of spurring the conversation and sort of localizing this conversation about climate change. That's super important. I think the president, to give credit to him, really met this moment because remember this is happening in the context of the CAHOSC, the AU Heads of States Committee on Climate Change. And so that's a conversation that has been happening they meet every year, they discuss things, they go to COP. We probably, most of us, if you're not in the climate change space, you do not know what they've been discussing or sort of what common positions have been advanced, right? So this has happened now, and we've had the conversation being brought publicly to the continent, and everyone is part of that. I think that's remarkable.
Is everyone part of it, really?
What I mean, no, probably not. But what I mean by everyone is part of it is that this has been a very public conversation. Have you heard before of the CAHOSC meetings?
Actually,
you haven't, right?
No.
But every year at COP28, the AU goes and presents a position on Africa. But most people do not know what that is. So there's value in that process.
When you say we need to have an honest conversation, are you then suggesting that we haven't been having an honest conversation?
We haven't. We probably even haven't had an honest conversation this time.
Good.
But what I'm saying is that we've had a public conversation, and I think that makes a huge difference.
See, I like what you're saying. We at least now can have an honest conversation. When you talk about climate change financing, even that concept alone, climate change financing, what exactly are you financing? Because you talk climate, me I hear weather.
Okay.
And when I hear weather, I hear rain, I hear sunshine, I hear drought. That's climate as far as I'm concerned. Question number one. When the West talks about climate change, are they talking about the same things we are talking about when we talk about climate change? Because there's the conversation that there's commonality. Where is it?
Okay. Interesting. So climate finance, when you talk about climate financing, you're basically thinking about financing three things, let's say. You're thinking about financing resilience, right? Adaptation and mitigation. Let me explain what that means, right? Is from a layman standpoint, what you're calling weather, right? Is changes in climate accumulating over years. And so what we are talking about when we talk about climate change is how that is impacting our lives now. If you go to a farmer, they'll probably not have the language of climate finance or climate change, but they can tell you how their crops have been affected, how rainfall patterns are changing and affecting, their crops, their land, and so on and so forth. We can see droughts affecting people.
Which means they understand it.
Yes. So it's also a science communication problem, right? Because it's about distilling this language into very perceptible concepts for general audiences.
Easily consumable.
Yes, precisely. But climate finance really just comes down to financing that. And the hard part with climate finance now becomes when you start talking about the issue of revenue.
You see,
and profits.
When you talk climate change and you go historical on it, we we've always had climate change.
Yes.
That's why people talk of the ice age. It's an age because it came to an end. We now have yes, it came to an end. We are now talking about some areas of the world that were predominantly ice-ridden, thawing. We are talking about oceans rising. If you want to go back into history, all these things have happened at a certain point in time. The fundamental difference has been the recurrence in the cycle is getting shorter and shorter and shorter.
Yes.
Before it would take a millennia. So several generations would have no clue whatever happened. Now, within one generation, you can see all these changes taking place. Now, I like what you said about science communication. Why is it then that when you look at a local peasant farmer, because they understand climate change, they had bans, meaning they knew a time comes when I may not have enough food and I can't grow it. They'll grow it. They understood the cycles. Why did they prepare for planting? They knew the cycles. They knew at this point in time, I'll be able to plant. They understood it. Okay. Are we saying that understanding, with all these green gas emissions and everything else, that what we understood and the patterns that were known have now changed? Now, what has changed them? And why is it that it's affecting us? Because clearly it has changed. It rains when it's not supposed to rain. The sun shines when it's not supposed to shine. Yeah. We have snow in Nyahururu, something which we're told we should not have. So all these things. Now, how exactly, when we talk about financing resilience, now, if I want a farmer to be protected from all these things, break down this resilience in this farming setup as a peasant and how that can actually be monetized, meaning money getting into my pocket so that when this occurrence, which is adverse, actually takes place, I'm resilient. And the money I have is able to protect me from what is about to come. Because if you start doing that, then you're saying you can predict the changes in climate. And yet, the whole conversation about climate change is the vagaries of it. So where are we really?
Right. Okay. So let me bring in, without getting too sciencey. You're right in the sense that the climate change is temporal. Like we see changes in climate over time. But when you look back at sort of the trends and the patterns of changing climate, what you'll find is that, and to speak to the point of unpredictability now, is that the increase in CO2 emissions as a result of human activity, what they call anthropogenic activity, which coincides with the Industrial Revolution, right, is what led to that increase in CO2 concentration in the air. And as a result, the predictability that we were talking about is no longer as predictable, right? And so this is what the conversation around decarbonization and removing, sort of cutting back on fossil fuels comes down to the resilience question. And again, why the climate conversation is very important is resilience is not an easy thing to finance because there is no profit to be made out of financing resilience, right? If let's say there is a flood and a village is wiped out, the money that, or a farmer's crops are wiped out, the money that steps in for that is not going to be investment from the private sector. It's not going to be what we call, it's not for profit investments, right? So typically this will be grant money, the stuff that, you go ask global governments to, give money for grants and stuff like that. And that's also not sustainable because this is also linked to taxpayer expenditure, right? And so that's why you hear, even from the conversation that the president was talking about, this idea of a global carbon tax, because you need to fund that expenditure from something. And the way to do it, the global carbon tax, which I know people have a problem with the idea of that, but the value of a global carbon tax is that it now...
So you're specifically identifying emitters pay into...